Welcome to Digital Tabletop Fest 2, the RPG edition, and welcome to the panel on alternative RPG settings. When you think of an RPG, you think of Dungeons and Dragons, naturally, great game, but that's the fantasy setting, and that's the kind of classic trope that people think of with an RPG. But it is far from where all RPGs are set, and we're here to explore that topic in a little more detail. My name's Tomas Rawlings, and I am the studio director at Auroch Digital, and I am joined by a fantastic panel to discuss this. So Justin, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Sure. I'm Justin Keenan. I'm a writer and narrative designer at Zaum, where I worked on Disco Elysium and Disco Elysium: The Final Cut.
Brilliant, thank you. And Natalie, welcome.
I'm director and writer at Lo-Fi Games. I worked on Kenshi and I'm now working on Kenshi 2.
Wonderful, thank you. And Bergur, if you could introduce yourself, that would be great.
Hey, my name is Bergur. I'm the creative director of EVE Online here in Reykjavik. And yeah, can't wait for this panel.
Fantastic. And last but certainly not least, Dmytro, if you'd like to tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're here, that would be great.
Thank you, Tomas, for having me here. I'm Dmytro, CEO of Snowhound Games, the creators of Deep Sky Derelicts Sci-Fi dystopian RPG. And I've worked as an executive producer for Deep Sky Derelicts since the first day of its development.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, let's just dig straight in there. So, like I say, when people think of an RPG, they think of Dungeons and Dragons, and that's that fantasy setting, that Lord of the Rings, that Tolkien-esque thing. Why do you think that so many people are using that kind of dragons, elves, dungeons, trolls setting? Why do we see it so much in role-playing games? I wonder, Justin, what's your thoughts? Why is it so common in RPGs?
I mean, I think there's a bunch of different reasons for that. Some good reasons are that that's like a world or aesthetic that a lot of people are already familiar with, from Tolkien especially, or Prydain, or like other kind of classic fantasy sources. But I think it's also sort of like a historical artifact. Like a lot of these RPG systems are based on Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons happens to have this Tolkien-esque setting, and so it like naturally flows from that people would say like, well, if we are adapting or developing like new systems that have that origin, that like those systems like naturally lend themselves to certain sorts of settings or stories. And I think that's one reason, and maybe one that like, you know, we can abandon more freely.
Yeah.
Like why so many RPGs end up the way they are.
That's a good point. And Bergur, I wonder if you could pick that up and think, you know, why Justin made that really great point about it's almost like a historical artifact now that you know, you get dragons, you get elves, you get trolls, you get dungeons. You know, how did you encounter this sort of trope?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point by Justin. I think there's a lot to this. I mean, we're all kind of brought up in the world of D&D and Magic the Gathering and these great IPs that have kind of formed our idea of you know, RPGs. But I think there's also another element with kind of the more, I don't want to use the word fantastical, but these kind of, you know, this settings, that is the more common setting, is that it's easier to kind of escape into it. It's easier to kind of build that world, and you don't need you know, it's a healthy step away from the reality that we're in, versus, for instance, sci-fi, which is oftentimes a more kind of a hyper realistic version of the reality that you live in. And this is definitely something that we see on EVE Online a lot. It's like people kind of, EVE Online is kind of a very extreme version of the reality that you're already living in, versus a kind of a more of a fantasy setting is something you can kind of take a step back and remove yourself completely from this side of reality.
And Natalie, you know, how much interactions have you had with that classic fantasy setting? You know, did you play D&D back in the day, or play it now, or something like that?
Not really D&D, but I'm definitely a huge Skyrim fan and Witcher fan. So I do love that kind of thing, and I think I'm basically saying the same as what Justin and Bergur said. But I think it's just that familiarity and being able to just sink in really easily, but still escape this world as well. And I think that's a really appealing thing. And I think also maybe on top of that, it is like the ultimate power fantasy, because magic is, ultimate control. You can do anything with magic, and I think it's just a nice escape from this world to actually have control and potentially be the most powerful person and the chosen one. And I think that's a huge appeal of fantasy.
That's a great point. That escapism. Yeah, I mean, sorry.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, I think that that ease of access or entry question is very important, because another thing to remember is that if you're not familiar with role-playing game systems, they can be like quite impenetrable at first. They're like, we've all probably played RPGs that take an hour to just like make your character before you've like done anything in the game world itself. And if you think of that in terms of like barrier to entry or whatever, there is like a lot of comfort in saying like, well, if I'm playing like Pillars of Eternity or Divinity Original Sin, that's not exactly like Dungeons and Dragons, but it's close enough that everything I've absorbed from playing Baldur's Gate or like tabletop D&D campaigns still translates in some way, and like helps ease that otherwise like pretty forbidding entry point.
It's a really good point, and I want to pick on that. I just want to come to Dmytro for a moment and see, did you see the kind of classic tropes as escapism, and picking up on Justin's point about the ease of access that makes it easy for people to understand what it is you're doing?
I think that I actually can relate to many good points made throughout this discussion of these specific questions, and I can agree that maybe there is some sort of a legacy to this, because if you've started back then in, I don't know, 90s, or maybe for someone in 80s to go into this whole D&D thing, then basically you should always feel right at home in pretty much any classic RPG these days. And many of them are actually way more accessible these days, more user-friendly, let's call it. But still, if you have that background, of course, it's always easier to really jump into it. Recently, I was playing Pathfinder, for example, and even though I have never played Pathfinder before, it has a system which is similar to D&D, but not exactly that. And I anyway felt very familiar to all the things which I saw there. And it took me again maybe even over 1 hour to generate my protagonist in that game, but still it was nice and interesting because I had that background. Maybe if I hadn't, it would be a disaster, and I would just walk away sort of. But also there were good points. I think that the escapism is definitely a good reason to play such games, and specifically this fantasy setting is good when kind of indulge in that, because I think everything is kind of simple or simpler in fantasy setting. You can be perfect hero. You don't need to face like difficulties of real life or some intricate things which we come across quite often in sci-fi settings. It's just maybe softer landing of sorts for people who love RPGs and play them often.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Well, flipping that around then, if your classic fantasy setting is accessible and it's easy for the player to understand what's going on, then when you're working on a new setting that isn't that has that has different world building rules, tropes, whatever we want to call it, how do you go about easing the player into that so that feel comfortable in this new world you're creating? And especially interested in the projects that you've worked on, how you achieve that trick. So if this time starting with you, Bergur, how do you get people so that they understand what's going on in EVE Online or a game like that when there's so much lore and other stuff that they don't come with because it's not intrinsic to the setting?
Yeah, I mean, we've spent 18 years trying to master that question, and in many ways, like, I don't want to say that we've been failing for 18 years, but we've been testing out very different approaches to that, and this is the biggest, most complex question at the company. How do you ease people into a parallel reality that New Eden, the world of EVE Online is, and how do you teach them how do you give them the core competencies of being able to move around in the setting and make it their home, make it a part of their reality. And this is something like I said, we've struggled with a lot for a very long time, and there's been a huge focus for the last 2 years on just that, and kind of this balance. We're kind of dancing this dance between creating a hand-told experience, tutorializing things, and then giving you directions into the sandbox, into the freedom of the RPG. And there is this, and you have to kind of you have to dance this dance between like holding people's hands and making sure that they understand the setting. They make them feel like they have purpose. They have they have a place in this world, and then that they have an agenda that they can get to, and they're part of something bigger. So it's a very difficult task, and it's not a task that you can just it's not another project you can do and take a box and just ship it. It's something you're constantly working on. You're constantly evolving, and you're constantly reacting, and I mean, the nature of a sandbox is the key ingredient is humans dealing with humans, so you can never really fully teach it. And that's kind of the beauty about one of the big beauties about these classic D&D and these games, is that you're constantly you're dealing with the other people in your party, and you're dealing with the DM, and you can never fully understand kind of what will come out of the session, and that's kind of yeah. So I'm not sure if there was an answer in that.
No. Well, there was an answer of like, we're working on it. We've spent 18 years working on it, and we're still working on it, which is a great answer. I mean, Natalie, in Kenshi has its own setting. I mean, I wonder if you could just describe briefly how you would call the setting, and again, how do you teach people the setting? Because again, similarly, yours has that very sandboxy kind of gameplay style. Yeah.
The setting, it is an open world sandbox in a world full of rusty swords, robots, samurai, and barren wasteland deserts. That is a good idea of the setting. Very Fallout, Mad Max, Dune inspired. And yeah, the same really. It's very hard easing the player into things. I think especially it's very difficult with a sandbox as well, because you can't really hold the player's hand either. So I find my rule really with myself is just simplicity, because as writers as well, we have a really bad habit of just getting carried away and just making really, really deep layered, way too heavy, complicated things that don't need to be that complicated. So I tend to have a little step back from my work sometimes and think I could probably whittle this down. This could probably be less characters, less. Why has this person got so many goals? They should just probably have one goal. And because I think when you're just trying to, throw all these things at the player, it's really hard for them to like actually care so much and get absorbed into it. And it can just be overwhelming and confusing and immersion breaking, I think. So that's one thing I try and do. And once I've established that key information that I want to convey, then I tend to focus all of my dialogue and writing on that. So it kind of paints a picture together, and you're just revealing things gradually and naturally. And I just focus my work that way.
I'm super guilty of what the things that you're talking about. Like we have some gnarly names in EVE Online that I can't even pronounce, and missions that just go way too deep into the narrative, like sentence 2, and you're like, oh my god, this is so complex.
I mean, Justin, I was going to come a bit more to Disco Elysium later on, but we sort of ended up at this point, which is an interesting one. One of the things I thought Disco Elysium did really well is a clever idea. Is starting with a character who doesn't remember anything that's happened. It's a perfect opportunity to teach the world as it all comes back. I mean, how would you describe the world of Disco Elysium, and how do you approach the world building?
Sure. So Disco's setting is really a kind of pastiche of like things borrowed from kind of like classic like American cop shows, but then combined with like a lot of essentially old Soviet sci-fi, especially like the Strugatsky brothers and that sort of thing, and then also like bits of kind of like 19th century like realist and naturalist fiction. Like Emile Zola is like an important person to a bunch of us. But these things all kind of like come together and are also inflected by real cities in Eastern and Northern Europe where a lot of our developers are from and where others of us have also spent a lot of time. And so that pastiche is like a part of the setting itself, but is also reflected in kind of our art style, which also has some like very 19th century or kind of classic painting influences. That's why like Rostov, our art director, developed this like really beautiful kind of classic oil painting style for the world map and the character portraits and that sort of thing. But then that's also inflected by a lot of kind of modern flourishes and styles. And so part of why I think like the world, and I'm using world a little more loosely here, like not just the lore and background, but the whole presentation works so well is because it's the art and the writing are both pastiches drawn from like kind of similar and analogous sources. About like how we introduce people to that world, I think I may have a sort of different take than Bergur and Natalie, but to me, if you're thinking about world building and how you are going to convey this background and this lore to people, the first question that you have to ask yourself is like, why why is this setting really where my like story or my narrative needs to take place? To me, the only real worthwhile world building is like what comes out of storytelling. Like we actually don't even talk that much about world building per se at Zaum, even though we have a very detailed and elaborate setting with lots of little narrative rabbit holes that people can go down. But if you think about the ways that this world building or background typically get presented to players in games, it's like in conversations with characters, or like the worst, through like books that are hidden in people's libraries or bookstores or that kind of thing, that are like not even real books, but just like one paragraph of excerpted text for no reason. And when I see that, it makes me what I think is like, one, if you're like burying your lore in like random spots, like that is telling me as a player that like you don't believe your lore is like that important. And another point is that if like the characters, like who are the figures who make up the story, aren't psychologically or thematically interesting, like no one should care about whatever lore or history or like political intrigue they are conveying to you. And so this is like a very roundabout way of saying that to me, world building or setting like naturally arise from the act of storytelling, and you know, mm, if you can find a way to like align those things, and this also has like implications for like a game's mechanics and the other ways that players interact with the game itself, then you like these kind of don't become problems to solve because it just works in some basic way.
No, that's interesting. I was going to turn to Dmytro. I'm not sure whether your tech is allowing you back in, Dmytro, to pick up on this point, the world building, but I think not quite. So hopefully we'll come back to you on that. But yeah, to sort of follow that, Bergur, you look like you wanted to follow that thread on.
Yeah, definitely. Like first off, I just need to like fanboy massively towards Justin. Like you have ruined the last 3 weeks since Tom reached out to like to come, join this panel. I was gonna play through like all the games, but Disco Elysium was the first one. It was on my list, so I already had it. And you've just completely ruined my whole gaming experience for the last 3 weeks. I haven't even been able to like play my regular Eve sessions due to me dying in Disco Elysium. And I mean, Disco Elysium has definitely been a big inspiration to developers here at CCP, and like especially like we've used it a lot as a reference to also not only the narrative, like the dialogue storytelling, but also the visual storytelling, the audio storytelling, this kind of visceral storytelling in many ways. And this is something that we've done. We've leaned into a lot in Eve because you have the stories, you have the player made stories, the player created kind of the player simulation in a way, where you have these beautiful epic stories about epic battles and backstabbing and things like that. And then you have the backstory of the world that we try to kind of portray a lot through the just visual storytelling. There is a reason why our Mars ships look this way, and you go to these regions and you can kind of visually tell that something happened. And this is something we're constantly trying to push further and further. And I think Disco Elysium does a great job on exactly that. Like you wake up, you have no idea where you are, but instantly you start to kind of fill in the blanks, and you kind of start to create this universe and this narrative, and then the narrative just adds kind of more sparks to build that story. And I think these are the best moments when you have these nice back and forth between dialogue, between visual, with audio, and in our case we then have the community that we can kind of react to as well. So you get this multi-dimensional stories that is sometimes very hard to maintain and rankle in, but I think that's kind of where the magic happens.
Well, yeah, I'm glad that you brought up the how much like the audio and the art contribute to world building as well, because we often talk about it as if like this is just the domain of the writers, but like that's not true at all. And if you like fire up Disco, for example, and like you walk out of the Whirling and Rags, which is the hostel that you start out in, before you talk to anybody, you're going to get those like beautiful, melancholic, spooky horns from the British Sea Power soundtrack, and like just see this like beautiful like oil painting broken art with this like very specific and deliberate palette of colors that evoke all these emotions. And like before you've read a word of the text that any of us wrote, you have already been like psychically and emotionally prepared for what kind of world this is.
And the magic is like you write these massive scripts, and like like every line you can delete with audio, visual, like these emotions, like you're kind of winning every time you manage to like, okay, we don't need this line of dialogue, we don't need this part of the script because we've kind of portrayed it, through all their senses.
Yeah, absolutely.
And to sort of develop a little more, then what was interesting is each of the games have got their own really recognizable setting, that the players have come to really love, as sort of explored. I'm wondering, and sort of throw a new question into this, how that setting came around a little more. You've talked about this a little, Justin, earlier, but starting say with you, Nat, I was wondering how the Kenshi setting came to be. Was it a conscious reaction to the classic RPG setting, and it's like it evolved in opposition to that in a way, for want of a better term, or is it actually that setting was the story that wanted to be told. I don't know if you know what you and your colleague Chris were thinking when back in those really early days.
I think it came about a lot as an anti-power fantasy of just being bored of being the hero that can do everything and solve everything, and everything revolves around them. And I think that was kind of what started it. We want the player to experience quite the opposite. We want them to experience powerlessness and struggle and survival and horrible, messed up stuff happening to them, like, and them not being the chosen one. So I think, and the world kind of had to reflect that. So the world is also just really scrappy and rusty and wonky, and it's not pretty. It is quite ugly in some ways as well. So yeah, I think the whole setting kind of grew around it like that. Like, we couldn't have had, I don't think magic and stuff like that would have suited our game, because magic is too hopeful. That's sounding really.
For somebody who's not played Kenshi, then, because I think it's one of the really key, interesting things that Kenshi does that I've not really seen many other games do, is that idea that there isn't the central character in quite the same way. I mean, how would you describe that? The character, the role of the character or characters within Kenshi?
Yeah, you can have one character, or you could have a squad of like 50 characters. So, sorry, I've gone blank.
Sorry, I put you on the spot.
I guess they're kind of, there is permadeath, so you can lose your characters. So I think a really big part of Kenshi is getting attached to your characters. And, you could be just walking along with some goal of going to some town, and then you get completely sidetracked, and one of your characters gets kidnapped by cannibals, and they're about to eat them, and they'll die forever. And I don't know if any of you ever played a game called Cannon Fodder, like in the 90s.
Yeah, very
like
much so.
That game is a pretty big inspiration to me. It was like, it was pretty simple, but you got so attached to those little guys, and just by their little names, and when they died, it was so sad. And then they just get replaced, but it's still like a little place in your heart. They had a little grave. And I think that's the kind of vibe we're going for around the characters with Kenshi. There is no main character. You just go along and you can find and recruit characters, but we do try to build this. We do want the player to build a rapport with them and actually care about them, and really try and have these little sidetracked, unscripted missions where you do have to actually go save your characters. So I'd say that is probably in a nutshell how the player character relationship is.
And so, Bergur, in Eve, then, similar question. How did the setting come about? Again, was it a conscious reaction to something, or is it you always knew that the intention was always to have that sort of space opera setting?
Yeah, the setting was created way before my time, but by good friends of mine. So I kind of know these stories by heart. But the development of EVE Online started in 1997 by a small group of Icelanders in Iceland, and there was no other gaming company and very little gaming experience in Iceland. So the setting came, partly, because of necessity. It's just, what can we do? Can we create a awesome sandbox game, with the know-how that we have? But there is also something. There's something very aspirational about space and occupying space and traversing space and these massive distances and being able to control something so big and dramatic, and the biggest spaceships, they're 10, 12 kilometers long, and it's quite dramatic. It's quite huge, because at the end of the day, as an EVE player, you don't start out as a hero. You're just another capsuleer in this world, and you slowly work your way up the ranks, and you find your niche, you find your play style, you find your kind of place in the world. And in many ways, we don't really, the game itself never declares heroes. Other players declare heroes. If that's and they declare them heroes from the things they have done, not necessarily what the things that they have. So if it's Katya Sai, who was the first player to visit every system of the game, or Kripa, who's the most trusted player. Like these legends are made by other humans, and that's kind of there's something that kind of space and this kind of sci-fi settings allows for this to happen. In this kind of barren, harsh world.
And then I think coming back to Disco Elysium, and hopefully Dmytro will come back in, and then I can join him in the conversation. I appreciate he's battling the tech, but yeah, coming back to Disco Elysium, you touched on a little at some of the inspirations and some of the writers and fictional stuff, former Soviet fictional stuff and cities and places like that have gone into it. What else sort of was in the mix in the creation of Disco Elysium, and why is it that kind of really interesting setting? Was there ever a time where it was going to be a fantasy setting or something else?
Yeah, so this was like way before my time, but some of the people who originally started developing the setting, which is just called Elysium, they started out as making a custom D&D campaign in Estonia in the early 2000s, and it started out with like a lot of lame magic systems and a big battle grid that you had to get out, and gradually the guys realized like this is really lame, we shouldn't do this, and they kind of kept slowly like moving the setting forward in time and kind of like saying, well, okay, this like medieval thing isn't really working. What if we do like some kind of early modern setting or some kind of quasi 18th or 19th century setting or whatever? And kind of gradually they realize like, we're actually just making something set in the like quasi present, the sort of eternal 60s 70s era. But then they also realized all these settings that they discarded could just become the lore and backstory of that same world. And I think a very beautiful thing happened, which is that like because it evolved quite naturally, like there is still some like aesthetic coherence to all of those discarded settings. And so like pieces of those earlier iterations like still stick around in funny ways. But yeah, I mean, it grew out of like people wanting to play their own version of Dungeons and Dragons and gradually stripping away things like grid-based combat and like spell systems that like didn't speak to them anymore.
That's really interesting. That I love that idea that all the past ones just become the lore, and I think that's one of the. You mentioned something, Bergur, when you talked about like the game's been in development for 18 years now. Well, longer than 18 years if it was 97 that they started. So it's been out 18 years. It's been in development even longer. At what point do you end up indulging in kind of world building or narrative archaeology at this point of trying to, much like Justin described for Disco Elysium, where the past pieces are kind of like connecting or resurfacing in the present, or how easy is it to move forward with a setting when you've developed that much stuff?
It was a really interesting. I had a really interesting beer conversation a few years back. We were kind of talking about, where we're taking the game, what we want to do, and what kind of talking about the past and the future, just what you do, I guess. Where we kind of started talking about how far into the future can you actually see, and there are some studies around this idea that you can't really see further than 5 years in the future. And when you have like 18 years of history, but you can only see 5 years in the future, then you kind of very quickly come to the conclusion that you have more past than future in a way. And it's a very interesting dilemma to kind of be in when you have all this legacy that you've built upon, and it can be very daunting. It can be very scary, and it's a thing that a lot of developers here, they fear this element a lot. But there is a lot of beauty in everything that has happened, and I mean, on the practical side, like we have a lot of storylines running at any given moment, and we have seeded storylines. Like we have storylines in EVE Online that were seeded in 2003, and no one has ever noticed them. Like no one has realized that there's a storyline going on that's been in like semi-active development for 18 years, and it's beautiful because we can like pick them up and we can like, do stuff with it, and then like cool it down again, and people 10 years from now, they're like, oh my God, this is happening now. And like, I remember this thing in 2021, that thing happened. And then like a thing happened in 2005, and it's all connected. It's all this like long arc that's been going on for like years and years, and we haven't noticed, until now. So it can be a very daunting thing on paper, but once you kind of get into it and you start to kind of you start to kind of understand the heartbeat of the universe, and you start to kind of move with the universe. This becomes a very fun thing to play with and work with and develop with the world. But the main thing is like, you have to kind of really train your kind of the humbleness within you, like your humbleness in listening to what has happened before, like where the game has come from, and kind of really work with kind of the constant evolvement of the world. We often you can almost look at EVE Online like one of the old corrugated timber houses, corrugated iron cladded timber houses in Reykjavik. You have these old houses built in the 17 something, and over the years they had to like swap out the windows, they had to swap out the cladding, they had to swap out the kitchen and the bathroom and kind of modernize thing. But the chimney is still there, like the core DNA is still there. But a lot of the game has changed and evolved over the years, because I mean, a game system from 2003 inspired by Dwarf Fortress is not necessarily something that's great in 2021. Like and so there's a lot of there's this constant evolvement, and you just have to learn to kind of live with it, and you have to learn to dance with it.
So I mean, Kenshi, Natalie, that's been in development, is it about a decade, I think, in total? I'm not sure. I remember you saying
possibly longer.
I mean,
when Chris was on his own.
Right, similar thing. How much lore has now been accumulated? Because it's also obviously been in development a while, but it's been out a while as well. I think you were in early access for quite a bit. How much lore has Kenshi accumulated over time?
It's a sensitive subject. I get lost. Yeah, it's tough. I find it very challenging. Just keeping lore and writing so much lore for like a huge world can be pretty difficult. But I think that it's harder at the beginning, and then the more you get it rolling, it just gets easier and easier, and things start fitting together. It's those first stages when you're first building bits, and they are definitely the hardest, when you're just coming up with crappy ideas, and it helps when it's already moving, basically, I think.
No, that's really interesting. And sort of to bring it back sort of full circle to Elysium, to the setting of Elysium, is there now a sense that you want to explore, or does the players want to explore these other older settings? Is there a sense of like, actually it would now be cool to go back to the Victorian version or the medieval version of Elysium and see how it might pan out, or is actually that is the past and let's kind of leave it a bit buried?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, and something that we bat around periodically, because a funny thing also happens when you start thinking about an older setting that you thought you had discarded, but now kind of inevitably what that setting has to be working toward, and then that starts to kind of create like, there are storylines that now make sense, but only in this kind of historical period. But I kind of want to go back to some of the stuff that Natalie and Berger were talking about, because I'm really interested in this idea of when you've been working in and thinking about a setting for so long that in a way, how do you stave off that feeling like it has more past than it has future? Because a thing that I think is very important is that you don't like it can kind of, I think you can sometimes get into this like little recursive thought loop where you think, the future is actually just like the past still. Like we have to keep recombining elements from our history into new things. But essentially what you're doing then is like cannibalizing your own ideas and your own setting. And that kind of sets like that really does kind of set like maybe a 5-year limit on how much more you can do with it. When like the trick is like, how do you keep that thing evolving in fresh and interesting ways and being comfortable with it changing and evolving, either like temporally or spatially?
Yeah, I think like actually that's why I use the word dance, because there's also the other, like the other side of that coin, where you have people that just like want to forget the past and just do new things. And I mean, for a very long time that was kind of the model of how we worked. We just, every 6 months we just rolled out something new, and it had to be new because it's not possible to sell old. You can only sell new. And that's kind of, that's the other view, and you have to kind of constantly be kind of playing that dance. And it is really beautiful, like once you learn the humility of what is kind of what has happened, and how that can inspire you on doing new things. And sometimes you just have to, like, sometimes you just bury storylines, and you put them under a rock for 3, 4, 5 years, and then you lift the rock and see, okay, this is something we can revisit now and allow to continue. And there are definitely things that are like core canon, and then you have the side stories that kind of spin. But it is definitely a dance. It's definitely like a very much a back and forth, and a fun one.
Well, so what's been interesting in the discussion, you've all kind of talked about other settings and other games and each other's work, and how you found it really interesting. So when you look outside your own kind of game, your own work areas, are there other titles that you look at and you think, oh wow, that's that is good world building? In fact, Dmytro, are you plugged back in? Because we'll pull you back into the conversation. Keen to get you in. I know you're fighting tech. I don't know if you can hear me. I'm guessing not. When you come back in, we'll try and pull you straight back in. But yeah, to come back to this question of, like, for me as an example, we're representing Achtung Cthulhu Tactics. Again, we worked on that, had this great setting of the Call of Cthulhu mythos mashed with the Second World War. It was created by Modiphius, and in our Mars Horizon setting, which is much more realistic, and it's about running a space agency, and effectively you create your own space race. So maybe it is the Soviet Union who are the first people on the moon. Maybe it was the Americans who get the first satellite in space. Maybe it's the Europeans. And it sort of has that but there were different things in doing that were pulled on there. And for me, one of the great examples of world building I think is really good is the Mad Max Fury Road, the most recent film, where they've got so much world in there just with the visuals of stuff. Like they talk about the bullet farm, and they don't explain what that is. It just sounds so evocative. You're like, that sounds a really interesting space. And they've got like shots with these people on these great big stilts going through this kind of thing in this salty marsh area. And again, they don't really explain it, but it's just really evocative. So is there other stuff outside there where you've looked at and gone, oh, what's the world building there? What's the interesting thing? Bergur, yeah. I mean, have you looked at other games and gone, yeah, that's cool. I'm impressed at that.
Oh, constantly, and everything. I mean, I'm very easily inspired, and I get inspiration from all sorts of things, like both games and film and books. Like, I mean, Hyperion has been a huge inspiration for just our thought process and kind of beautiful sci-fi building. The culture series as well. I also architecture has huge. I'm trained as an architect, so architecture has huge inspiration on the work that we do here, and kind of urbanism and the idea of like, how Brasilia was built, or if it's Ukrainian brutalism or anything like that, all the way to fashion. Looking at the early collections from Alexander McQueen and the beautiful worlds that he created, and that like kind of they're almost like an invert of when you read the book. When you look at these beautiful fashion collections, you just see the visual medium, but you're lacking everything else. While you read the book, you get like all the information, but you're lacking the visual medium. So the inspiration for EVE Online comes from a lot of different places. But I think the seed for EVE is definitely Alien, Blade Runner, and those films are, and early heavy metal magazine definitely has a huge inspiration for the world. But no, I mean, I think inspiration is such a wonderful tool, and everything we do is just we're constantly gathering tools for a toolbox, and it's on us to recognize that these are tools, and then to figure out how we can actually yield these tools and fold them into the world that we're creating. And if it's films or games or cooking, like, I mean, it's on you to kind of figure out how we can use the French onion soup to really tell a story.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And it's really interesting to know where the various things are drawn from. Same question then to you, Nat. Like, are there other titles, fiction, games, be what they may, that you look at and go, love the world building there?
I think for me, I've been a huge fan of the Fallout series. That's just a huge inspiration to me ever since the first one. I don't know. It's just so dark, and all of the vaults are so yeah. Just the way you have these messed up experiments, and you can just explore what horrible things happened to all of these inhabitants. And I just think the way that it's all shown is, it's just, I'm just a huge fan of Fallout games, basically. And I think Fallout New Vegas as well, that was my last favorite one. And just seeing what has happened to civilization, and seeing these messed up kind of mutants rampaging in the world, and just seeing it through the enemies of the world, and I think that's a really great way of portraying what's happened to a world, and it's the kind of thing that we use a lot for the storytelling in our game as well. Like, for example, if you were to see starving bandits, that says a lot about what has happened to the inhabitants, and the desperation for food and things like that. Sorry, I completely digressed onto our game here.
Digress how you see fit. No, it's fine. It's fine.
It's just rambling off and then brought our game up. Sorry.
But actually, on the Fallout stuff, sorry, I think it's so interesting, and I mean, we of course, Fallout has also had huge impact on us, and we get our inspiration from like very similar seeds. But there is like what Fallout manages to do so well is this kind of, it doesn't matter how dark and gritty and disgusting the world becomes. Like, we all just want tiny bit of joy, and we all just want kind of to feel loved, and like it doesn't matter how gritty and everything difficult things become. Like, there's still like this just element of, I just want to have fun in a way. And I don't know, I even if the game doesn't necessarily kind of talk about it, that's always the feeling that I get. It's just like, oh well, it's just another giant cockroach attacking me, but let's make the best out of it. And I mean, it's very similar in EVE. It's like, it's dark, it's gritty, you're constantly under the threat of someone attacking you. You're never fully safe, and it's just really tough to do it alone. So you find another person, and you become really good friends really quickly, because you're in this like dark, gritty thing. And then you meet people at FanFest, and they're just having fun, and like you listen to people on comms, and it's just there's so much joy, even if like the darker it becomes. I guess, you know, the blacker the black becomes, you know, the brighter the light will shine in a way. But
No, it's interesting. With, you know, again, on Mars Horizon, we were lucky enough to work with the European Space Agency, and we got invited down to visit them. Went down to visit them, and it was the closest thing to Star Trek I've come across. There was this building with all these people from different nations, and they were all working on this project together. And the aim of the European Space Agency is to further human knowledge. You know, and they're you know, like we were talking to people on the ExoMars mission who are sending this rover up to drill under the surface of Mars. They're looking for past or future signs of life. It's absolutely fascinating. And yeah, I just couldn't help myself thinking, like, that optimistic thing that you described with space, that hope, and that, you know, at the time I was playing a bunch of games that do have that much more darker post-apocalyptic sort of vibe. I was playing at the time I was out there. I was playing the Rebellion's game, the zombie, Zombie Army Trilogy, which is such a bleak setting. It's like, not only is there a world war, but there's zombies everywhere as well. It's like really bleak. And so the kind of positivity of space, like, you know, we really wanted to reflect that in Mars Horizon, and I think we did, and really proud of that reflection. But yeah, I mean, you know, coming back to you, Justin, on that similarly, you know, what other things did you feel, you know, when you're looking around and sort of seeing other stuff, is there other stuff you're looking at and going, yeah, I really like that?
Yeah, for sure. I'm really glad you brought up Fury Road, because I think about Gastown and the Bullet Farm and the Green Place and all that sort of thing a lot. Like, it's really a phenomenal example of like fable-like kind of condensed elemental storytelling, which is also like, I think, less true of the later Fallout games, but like Fallout 1, definitely. I like replayed it recently and was struck by kind of how like Old Testament it feels to like go back and explore some of those settings. But in terms of like just like a few other games, for example, Hyper Light Drifter, I think is like one of my favorite games from the last some years, and I think it does phenomenal world building without a single word of text. You know, it's all color and animation and music and mood, and because like this, at the end of the day, like, world building is about establishing tone and atmosphere more than anything else. And all these things that we have, like text or music or art, or visual art rather, are all just about evoking mood. And if your lore and your history and whatever doesn't evoke a mood or a tone, it's like not doing anything. I'm thinking about a couple of other games where, you know, the gameplay itself is in some ways excavating what the world is itself about. So like Outer Wilds, for example, like, or Portal, another perfect game with like extraordinary world building, and the story of the game is in fact coming to understand the nature of the world itself, which is both like a clever gameplay mechanical thing, but then also like a perfect theme, like from like human storytelling for like 1,000 years. You know, like, what is the world really about, and how does it work, and how does the story that you're telling and the mechanics that you have to explore that setting, like, contribute to that theme.
Yeah, I mean, that what you talked about, like excavating the world, one of the, you know, so one of the non-fancy settings that, you know, I've enjoyed and realized I've enjoyed basically its whole existence is the Warhammer 40,000 setting, which I'm a big fan of. And, you know, I came across that on the launch of the original. I've still got first edition on my bookshelf in Pride of Place. And I realized, like, what's really interesting with that is it's been going so long now, and they've had so many different books and things like that, that it actually mirrors real history, which is, you know, people publish real history books where there'll be a primary source, and they'll argue that actually your take on, you know, this important historical event, this king's reign or this queen's reign or this peasant uprising or whatever, you know, they get reevaluated constantly in the light of new evidence, and different sources from the past take different, you know, different takes on it. And people do exactly, you watch lore videos for 40k and they're doing exactly the same thing, which is they're essentially arguing, well, this codec here, we should give more precedence to the weight of that because it's considered more canon, and this this short story here where they talk about this, actually, that doesn't have it. And I find that really fascinating that they've done that. And as I say that, I think we've got Dmytro back. I'm glad you were able to join us. So it'd be really great to hear a little bit about the world building that you do in Deep Sky Derelicts. It's this dystopian setting. How did it come about? What is it? Could you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, sure, of course. So Deep Sky Derelicts, it was mainly based on, it's actually had multiple inspirations and influences which we used for world building. Of course, I wouldn't call this game very heavy on that aspect, but still, we really tried to make it feel and look and sound distinct of sorts. And if I'm to single out a couple of major influences, those would be the Incal graphic novel made by Jodorowsky, a pretty famous writer who and I guess a director who before that worked on some Dune series, even which got cancelled in the 70s. And an artist who worked on that, French artist Giroux, is also pretty famous. And I think that Incal series served as the main inspiration for the art style and overall aesthetics of Deep Sky Derelicts. And even though I'm not actually a big kind of fan or not very knowledgeable about those series, it's more art director's contribution to this. Still, I think that if we look into the world building aspect, it took at least some of the vibes from the Incal, and specifically the events unravel on a small insignificant planet somewhere the outskirts of a galaxy which is dominated by human race, and there is a clear distinction, clear gap between these societal classes there. And I think the story takes place in a huge pit city where some like fortunate aristocrats live in a very good hospital conditions, but those like the poor ones, they live in those pits with some mutants and marginals of all kinds, and that sort of part of an inspiration. The other one I think which was significant is the film, American science fiction action movie called Elysium. I think it was directed by Neil Blomkamp. And there the premise is even more similar to what we have in Deep Sky Derelicts. The only significant difference is that the scenery is sort of flipped compared to the movie. So in the movie, the poor people, those who kind of have to fight for their status in society, they live on the surface of the ravaged earth, and the rich ones, the aristocrats, they dwell on a luxurious space station which is called Elysium. And that kind of very initially came across to our ideas, but we just flipped kind of the sides, and we thought that we want the rich ones live on the surface of planets, those hospitable planets, and this should feel as a sort of a luxury in this world. So the idea was that mankind created this technology to terraform maybe those worlds, to somehow make these pristine planets with lush nature and all that. But because of some limitations of that technology, you couldn't actually provide space for everyone. And so only the priority classes of society could live there. But those stateless, they had to dwell on those ramshackle and dilapidated space stations. So that created.
Yeah, no, it's a brilliant game, and I really enjoy playing it. And apologies, we haven't had the time to explore it fully, but I'd recommend everybody watching go and check out Deep Sky Derelicts because it's fantastic. And I have a few seconds left, so I just want to use that to thank everybody for their time. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation, and I would heartily recommend everybody goes out and checks out all the games on the list on the description for this, because they are all brilliant games with amazing world building that I'm sure everybody will really enjoy. So yeah, thank you all for your time. Really appreciate it. And please do check out all the other talks on Digital Tabletop Fest too. Thank you.